Can we just vote on this already? All right, welcome in. It's the Breer Report for May the 23rd. We are back from the league meeting, and to wrap up this week, we are going to wrap up three of the biggest stories from the spring meeting as we send it into Memorial Day weekend. Those three biggest stories from the spring meeting: number one, the NFL owners voting down a proposed ban of the Tush Push. Number two, the withdrawal of the playoff reseeding proposal by the Lions. I think that thing still has legs, and it's something we are going to be talking about here over the next year or so at least. And then number three, the integration of NFL players into Olympic flag football in 2028. All right, number one, the first topic for this week, and this is the topic that I'm a little sick of talking about, and I want to give you guys an explanation on why I think the league's effort to get the Tush Push pulled out of the NFL failed this week. And I think the main thing you want to look at is how complicated this got, and how I think by the end of it, a lot of people were like, the hell with this. And you have to go back to the start and kind of where we were going into the March meeting and the different arguments that we were hearing on two sides of this that I think didn't necessarily tie into one another. You had the league side of this, which was a health and safety argument. And there really isn't a ton of injury data showing that this play was either detrimental to the health of Jalen Hurts or any of his linemen. However, what the league would argue, and Dr. Alan Sills was sort of the tip of the spear in this one, the league's chief medical officer, is that if there is an injury here, and the injury hasn't happened, but if there is an injury here based on the posture of the lineman, based on the posture of the quarterback, it will be catastrophic. And I think for the NFL office, once you start talking about that in that sort of forum, if something were to happen, there's obviously some liability, which helps to motivate them to try and get the play banned. Then there's the other end of it, which is the teams that were against allowing the Tush Push. And I think the main argument you heard there was that it's a rugby play. It's not a football play. It's not a play that optically looks good for fans. It's not a play that is organic within the constraints of football. And so, I think when you got to the league meeting, the big league meeting in March, and the teams were listening, they were hearing two separate arguments. I think the Eagles are saying, well, you're just trying to get it taken out of the game because we're really good at it. And the idea that you had two separate arguments conspiring against the Tush Push, it sort of made people in the room feel like, okay, is this just grasping at different things to try to make sure that we get this play that the Eagles have become almost unstoppable running out of the game? So that's where you were coming out of March. And they, at that point, the vote was about 16-16. So to get to the 24 votes, still a long way to go for the NFL if they were going to get the Tush Push banned. So then within that league meeting came the idea that you want to maybe go back to the 2004 rule. And in 2004, the rule had been that there was no allowable pushing or pulling of an offensive teammate of any kind. It got removed from the rules in 2005. The reason why was because on downfield plays, you get these scrums and offensive players would come flying in. And it was hard for officials to delineate whether they were blocking an opponent or pushing a teammate. And so to make it more black and white, they pulled that rule out. It actually had nothing to do with the way the Eagles used the pushing element. And so there was that idea from the competition committee, from Rich McKay, the chair of the competition committee in general, why don't we look at going back to the old writing of the rule? So they went from the Packers went from having a very, very narrow proposal that would essentially just take what the Eagles are doing out of the game to this big, broad proposal, which got some people on board, but then other people not. And so when the final rewriting of the proposal was presented, and this would have been just earlier this week, it reflected that 2004 rule, and it got some more people on board, but then it got some other people questioning that. And should you be legislating effort? If I have a lineman running downfield and pushing the pile, is that necessarily a bad thing? Or should we be encouraging that sort of effort from our players? And so this thing got so complicated. And then I think in the room, it got personal. By the end of it, by the end of it. You'd heard from Jason Kelsey. You'd heard from Eagles owner Jeffrey Lurie, and then the assistant general manager, John Ferrari, who used to work at the league office, started to talk about the application of the rule and the way it's officiated. And at that point, people in the room were so sick of it that you started to get back and forth between Ferrari and individual owners. It happened with Ferrari and Jerry Jones. It happened with Ferrari and Terry Pagula. And then at the end, it happened with Ferrari and Niners owner Jed York, who basically said, can we just vote on this already? And he actually joked that if the conversation was going to go any longer, that he was going to have to go get himself a bourbon. But I think that's how everyone felt. It was just worn out by it. And so, I think this thing has gotten so tangled up and gone so far and been so over discussed that I think there's just this feeling almost like I don't care what happens either way, which I think prevented the band from getting the support it would have needed to get all the way through. And people have asked, what does this mean going forward? Well, we'll see. We have 285 games between now and the next time they talk about it. Maybe somebody figures out a way to stop it, and the Eagles aren't successful this year, and it's a non-issue going into 26. If there's an injury, God forbid, that could affect things. But as far as where we are right now, again, we have those 285 games in front of us to further study, to further determine where this is going forward. Okay, number 2, Detroit's proposal about reseeding the playoffs. It didn't have very much support back in March. Only about a handful of teams were in support of it, but this was something the league really wanted. The NFL really wanted to take a hard look at this. And the reason why is because more and more coaches have been gaming out, playoff coaches have been gaming out the 17th and 18th weeks of the season. And I think it really came to a head this year with what the Rams did. And Sean McVay decided in week 18, it was more important to rest his team than it was to fight for the 3rd seed rather than having the 4th seed. And so they lose the 3rd seed, which would have been the opportunity to play the Commanders in the first round. They get the 4th seed, which meant playing a 14-win Vikings team. Meanwhile, while his players are resting, while McVay's players are resting, you have the Vikings in an all-out war against the Lions for the NFC North on Sunday Night Football. What happens the next week? Well, the Rams are rewarded for the strategy that they employed there. And I think that scares the NFL because they look at each of these individual games as pieces of real estate that they can sell to the broadcast partners. And they want every game to be as compelling a product as they possibly can, regardless of what the goals of the individual teams are. So how can they motivate that? Well, one way you could motivate it is by creating the open seating system that would put more on the line at the end of the season. This could be an even bigger issue when you're talking about how you manage players down the stretch if you go to an 18-game season. So it's something that the NFL really wanted to talk about. And when they got in the room earlier this week, there wasn't much more support for it to vote it through than there had been in March. But that wasn't the goal. The goal was to create more conversation. And from the stories I heard inside the room, Rams president Kevin Demoff, I think, probably made the most poignant remarks, which to me, he asked the room, what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to make the game more compelling at the end of the season, or are we trying to be fair? Because if you're trying to make it more compelling, it's probably going to be materially less fair to some teams. In other words, because the schedule is what it is, because the schedule formula works the way that it works, you are not going to have apples to apples comparisons between teams. I'll give you an example. The NFC East this year plays the NFC North and the AFC West. There are 6 playoff teams of the 8 in those 2 divisions. The NFC West, meanwhile, plays the 2 South divisions. There are only 2 combined playoff teams of the 8 in those divisions. And I believe the number is 5 of the 8 had 12 or more losses last year. You have teams you would have teams between the NFC West and NFC East competing in completely different environments. You could argue that an 11-win team in the NFC East, based on having played against the North and the AFC West, would be more impressive than, say, a 13-win team from the NFC West, which played against the 2 South divisions. So if you're going to have an open seating system, that's not going to be fair this year to the NFC East team if things stay the way that they are. So how do you solve that? And I think that's the question now going forward. If you are going to look at an open seating system, do you look at the scheduling formula? Do you look at the idea of deconstructing the divisions? There are lots of big picture things that you would have to look at. And I think as we move closer to the new broadcast deals, there's an opt-out in 2029. As we move as we move towards the 18 game season, I think they'd like to have the 18 game season in place before they go to market for looking for new broadcast contracts. And in fact, if you look at the Super Bowl schedule, we don't have a date for the Super Bowl in 3 years in Atlanta, and that sort of feels like that might be the target to change the calendar. These are all big picture things that need to be talked about. And I think that was sort of the goal this week, was how do you open those big picture conversations? Okay, finally, our third topic is the topic of Olympic flag football. The NFL voted this week to allow its players to play in the Olympics. That's going to open a bigger discussion on how that's all going to work, how players are going to be protected against injury in those situations, what this is going to look like from a team-to-team perspective. How many guys are going to play for the U.S. team? Are you going to have guys playing for Team Ireland, Team Italy based on their heritage? The example I could remember from years ago was at one point Mike Piazza played for Team Italy. Are you going to see those sorts of scenarios where American-born players with heritage in other countries are going to play for those other countries? I think these are all interesting questions to ask. But if you want to really know the root of the NFL's motivation here, and the root of their motivation in pushing all things flag and pushing the IOC to adopt flag football as an Olympic sport, and pushing high schools to sanction flag football as a varsity sport, it's about exporting the game. It's about getting as many kids playing as possible. And the reality is that football is an incredibly hard game to export. The reality is young girls generally, and there are exceptions, but young girls generally don't play tackle football. And the NFL feels like as long as there are limits on how many how many kids are playing overseas, there are limits on how much you can grow. And so this is not an easily exportable sport. Again, it's not like basketball. You can put up two hoops, you can lay down some blacktop, you can roll out a bag of balls, and you can have kids playing right away. It's not soccer where you put a couple goals on a field and roll out a bag of balls and let them play. The insurance, the numbers that you need to play the game, the equipment, the violence of the game, like there are just so many elements that make this a very difficult sport to export. So anything the NFL can do to legitimize flag football beyond it just being a sidecar to the NFL game is, or to the tackle game, is something the NFL is going to invest in, because it has to do with their growth globally. It also, I think, relates to their growth and popularity with women. These are areas where they see there being growth. And so, let's call this what it is. It's a business proposition. It's a business proposition for the NFL to be pushing the game into the Olympics, and then for the NFL to be allowing players in. It will be interesting to see how teams approach this. If you're in a championship window with players like Patrick Mahomes or Joe Burrow or Lamar Jackson, do you allow it? I mean, it sounds like the NFL is going to mandate you allow it. What are you going to be saying to your players? If you're a player, how do you handle this? I think that's an open question as well. It was interesting. They had Justin Jefferson come over to talk to us at the league meeting, and someone flat out asked him, are you planning on playing in 2028? And it wasn't just a yes. It was sort of, that's going to depend on my circumstances at the time and whether I'm willing to take the injury risk and all of those different things. So a lot will go into those decisions. There's a lot of discussion to be had there, but obviously this week they really got the ball rolling on the idea that NFL players could play in the Olympics. I'm not even positive, to be clear here. I'm not even positive, how these guys would match up against the guys who are training year round to play the sport, because I've said this. I mean, I coach youth football. I've said this to parents when they ask about it. It's like, the reality is, what your kid thinks tackle football is and what it actually is. There's a bigger gap between those two things than exists in any other sport. Tackle football is not the same thing as flag football. It is a completely different sport. So that's the other part of it, is like, it'll be interesting to see how NFL athletes fit into what's a very, very different game and really a completely different sport. Appreciate you guys coming out. As always, We will take your feedback. We love your feedback. You can get me your feedback at Albert Breer on Twitter, at Albert_Breer on Instagram, at Albert R. Breer on Facebook. We will be back with another Breer Report at some point early next week. Enjoy your Memorial Day weekend.